Now, speaking of things in society, moving on to our next one here, the rise of Boise. Brooks reports highlights growth and gaps. So across the state, as we have all heard the reports and probably seen the growth, there's no place that knows that better than Boise/the Ada County area, which has experienced a remarkable amount of growth over the last 2 decades or so. This is highlighted by a recent report from the Brookings Institute, in which they have looked at the Boise Metropolitan Statistical Area, encompassing Ada, Boise, Canyon, Gem, and Owyhee counties, where they pointed out a surge in growth, prosperity, and inclusion, with significant changes in the racial inclusion as well. Don't worry, I'm not crazy about the race part. More on that later, how it's actually kind of a good thing. According to the report, Boise ranks second out of the 55 large metropolitan areas for growth, with a 40.5% increase in jobs and a 60.2% rise in gross metropolitan products from 2012 to 2022. The numbers of jobs at young firms has also skyrocketed by 80.9%, indicating a robust entrepreneurial ecosystem, which I know we hear about growth a lot and different stuff going on in the state, and it just sounds like another report. But bear with me, this one was actually very interesting, and I think it would be helpful. But before we can really dive into that, I think we need to understand the methods and who the Brookings Institution is.
Right. So the Brookings Institution is a nonprofit public policy organization, and it's based in Washington, D.C. Their stated aim is to conduct in-depth, nonpartisan research to improve policy and governance at local, national, and global levels. They were founded in 1916 as the Institute for Government Research by Robert S. Brookings, who was a merchant, a manufacturer, and a philanthropist. And there were also some other people involved in that founding. But with that said, their stated goals are to strengthen American democracy, foster the economic and social welfare, security, and opportunity of all Americans, and secure a more open, safe, prosperous, and cooperative international system. So there are some more left-leaning ideas in there, but they have been trusted for some time, and from what we can see, they're generally trustworthy. So the next question then is, how did they make this report? Well, as for how they did this, they attempted to assess the United States growth by looking at 3 different sizes of metropolitan areas, totaling 194 areas. The 3 groups are broken down into very large metropolitan areas with populations above 1 million, large metro areas that are between 250 and 1 million, and then mid-sized metro areas with populations of at least 250,000. So the Boise area does land in that large category of between 250,000 and 1 million.
So if you take that ranking and like, oh, we're third, how are we third in the nation? Well, we're third in the nation for that metropolitan area between 250,000 and 1 million. But if you were to compare us to over or above 1 million, then we look small. So kind of that context there.
Right. So it's important to know. It's important to know, when, especially when you're looking at statistical analysis, what the bounds of that analysis are. The next thing to be aware of is how the Brookings Institute is actually scoring these things. So they're scoring this based on 5 areas: growth, prosperity, overall inclusion, and then racial inclusion and geographic inclusion. So growth, they're looking at real GDP, total employment, jobs at young firms. For prosperity, they're looking at wages, productivity, and then standards of living. Overall inclusion is employment rate, median earnings, relative poverty. Racial inclusion is an unemployment gap, I guess white versus people of color, and then an earnings gap or a poverty gap. And then geographic inclusion is neighborhood employment gap, neighborhood earnings gap, and then a neighborhood poverty gap.
Which on that neighborhood poverty gap, the interesting part about that is they're actually taking, I think it's it might be both the earnings and poverty one, but they're taking those analytics based on the top 20% in a given area and the top lowest 20% and then comparing the difference in that gap.
Right. Well, because we all know that when there are economic disparities, that's when things get weird. And that's when conflict happens. If we're all poor together, then it's fine. It doesn't really matter. If we're all rich together, that's fine. We're all the same. But if I'm living next to Elon Musk, well, that's no longer okay. Like, I live a comfortable life. I drive a car. I have a house. That's great. Elon Musk owns rocket ships and can go to space. We're on completely different planes. And so
planets, you might say. Sorry, I couldn't help it.
Almost. That's funny. And so, if I'm comparing myself next to Elon Musk, well, clearly it looks like I'm very, very poor, even though I'm doing pretty darn good. And
Right.
so I think that's where these poverty gaps, or the earnings, poverty, and employment gap, they really are important, because that neighborhood needs to be cohesive, at least in that sense.
Right. And I wouldn't have chosen the language. I think they're trying to get some winnings on the DEI score with the word inclusion. But if there again, that's why I wanted to have these subcategories when we were talking about it. Because yes, they're saying geographic inclusion. I would have not used that verbiage. That is totally modern vernacular, but I wanted to be accurate to how they're defining it. I probably would have gone with like, what is there's a specific word in statistics that it's talking about the level of deviation between two different data sets. That word, whoever's out there that does statistics, you'll know what I'm talking about. I would have done that instead of inclusion. Same with like the racial part there again. And the overall part, not overall inclusion, racial inclusion, geographic inclusion, because it's just a modern overused term. And then for all this data that we are looking at here, the main two they used were the U.S. Census Bureau for their data and EMSI estimates. And diving into that a little bit for those exact details for this area and coming back to Idaho, we in the large categories we talked about earlier come in second out of across the entire nation. In our jobs area, so changes in jobs measures the total number of occupied full-time wage, salaries, employment positions. Okay, yeah, so basically jobs people hold. So in the job sector, jobs and change, over the course of from 2012 to 2022, we had 40.5% growth in that area. Changes in gross metropolitan products, so GDP, we had 60.2% growth over that period. And we also had 80.9% growth in jobs at young firms. So basically new businesses, small businesses, stuff like that, which kind of, as they're saying, and I would agree with that data, that shows that entrepreneurial businesses are welcome to get started. Now, the question does become how long they last. That report doesn't quite get into it. That would be another thing to look at. But it is a good indicator that people in Idaho love to start businesses and they're able to achieve those and actually even hire people for jobs beyond just themselves for that. Then getting poverty topic, we rank 5th in the nation for large, same period, 2012 to 2022. We ranked 12th for change in productivity, so we had an increase of 14%. We came in number 6 for a change in average annual wages, so we had a 21.5% increase in wages over that period. Then we also ranked 5 in the nation for large when it came to changes in standards of living. We had a 25.9% according to their evaluation. Which then that brings us on to the overall inclusion rating. That's where we start getting into areas where obviously the elite don't like us as much. In conclusion, we come in about 13 out of all of the large ones, which you wouldn't expect us to do that. One of that is a change in employment rate. That we come in 34th out of all the large cities in the United States that they looked at a 4.6% increase over that period of time. We came in number 5th for change in median earnings, so we had a 31.2% increase, so people getting raises, more money on the median there. And then 13, a change in relative poverty rate, so we had a 4% decrease over that period overall of poverty, so just saying that people are less poor by a factor of 4%, which is good to hear at 13. Then on the racial inclusion part, we came in number 10. I don't know if that's just because we don't have a lot of different minority groups in Idaho besides Mexicans, but anywho, we came in number 8th for change in white/people of color employment rate gap. So that came by negative 0.7%, basically saying if you have one line, that's the amount of money that Hispanic or other people are getting, and then another line for all the white people, the difference between those two, how close they are, they got closer, in a sense, by 6.7%. This is the part that kind of stung, I guess, a little bit more. We come 37th in the nation, so that's change in white/people of color median earnings gap. It increased by $550. And then we came in at number 9 and change in white/people of color relative poverty rate gap at a negative 6.1%. And in geographic inclusion, we came in 50th in the nation. So at 44, we came change in top/bottom neighborhoods employment rate gap. It increased by 1.5%. Change in top/bottom neighbors medium household income gap. Came in 50th there at 17,257. So that's that difference between the top people and the bottom people, that medium amount of income per household. So being a little bit larger. And then we came in 38th in change in the bottom to top neighborhoods relative poverty rate gap at about negative 3.6%. So, lots of words, lots of things. You're welcome to go read the article. And doing this over audio is not the best. In a perfect world, we would have more of some info, and who knows, maybe this week as we're editing it, John will have some of these things up. We'll see if time allows, we'll put it that way. One of the things when I was reading this article, and I thought it was just the beginning natural objection someone might give, is how is this a good thing for Idaho? And from that, a lot of people in Idaho, many I love dearly, will say Idaho doesn't need to get any bigger. What made it great is being washed away by that growth. If we keep growing the way we are, we're not going to be the Idaho that was to attract that greatness to begin with, right? The initial answer I would give to that is, one, a bit of a monetary only answer, but that bringing more money into the state isn't a bad thing. Having that greater income coming into the state means for skilled workers, which we have that, we have U of I, we have CWI, we have BSU that train some pretty competent people. If you have more money coming into the state for more skilled jobs, that means those people who probably have already grown up here and really love the state can actually stay here and contribute towards the state in different ways and stuff, rather than leaving and going off to other places. And so we invested all this money and time, and then these people just disappear, which is another segment. We're going to dive into that deeper later on, and probably the next month. But the part I want to focus on a little bit more about that worry of growth part, you should probably then be more involved in the political aspect so that you can direct that growth, because you're not going to be able to stop it, as we've talked about multiple times in the show.
Yeah, growth is going to happen, and I'm living proof of that. We moved here in 2019, so shoot, that's 5 years ago now, which is a long time for me to be in a single place. But you're not going to stop people moving here. I've talked about that down in Austin. Austin was the same way. You weren't going to stop people from moving into Austin. We saw the same thing happen to Colorado, I don't know, decades ago, is a ton of people moved there. And the question is, how do you stop the place that you're living from changing to something that's not good? Well, we've also seen this in the United States. When people come in with the idea that they want to assimilate and become a part of the community that they're moving to, that's good. That's what we want to encourage. When people come in and say, wow, this is a cool place. I want this to be like my old place because my old place has good ideas. They just, I don't know, reasons are bad. So like we want people moving here who are passionate about the things that we want to have people be passionate about. And so, if you're passionate about something, well, then you should be involved in something. If you're not involved in something, and then you tell me, well, but I really want this thing to be that way. Okay, but do you? Because you're not involved. Right. So, like, get involved.
And also, on that fact, I think Idaho thus far has done a really good job with it. One of the cool things about Idaho is, for lack of a better, our public perception to other states when, say, a person's sitting in California or sitting in Washington and thinking about, well, where should I move to? And they're looking down the list and they come to Idaho, right? The public perception of it is that it's really conservative, it's really rural, and if you don't like those things, it's not going to work out well, for lack of a better word. That's the marketing. And so that will naturally filter, actually, I think, a lot of people. And we've seen that, like we talked about, I think, a month or two back with the voter registry rolls of the people moving here and how they're registered. A lot of them are registered Republican. That doesn't mean they're going to vote exactly that. But it does show a certain sign that it is the public perception outside of our state when you're choosing to move does have that filtering effect. And to keep that filter up, to encourage that, we should try to be involved in our politics so that the type of society we create attracts those that we want and repels those we don't want in our state.
It's very true. You're absolutely right.
But then coming into another part that I teased earlier we were going to get into, which is the racial part, and coming more from that fiscally conservative perspective. And if John, as I'm talking about this, you can go look at the chart if you're curious. Hispanic or any groups that aren't white in Idaho actually, on average, according to the median income, make more. And so in this, you could see the leftists being like, this is a horrible thing. I actually think it's a great thing, but it was showing that the gap between those two, between white and then whatever else, because that's how we like to categorize things, because apparently, yay, we're going to do it that way, that shrunk, which I think is not a bad thing at all. It also is an encouraging thing that if you, so woe is me, I'm Hispanic and I came from somewhere else or whatever. No, on average in Idaho, you're actually going to be making more money than your white counterpart. Be that our culture, be that other things, be that work ethic that some of the Hispanics have in the Valley. I'm not going to get into that right now, but I would say seeing that those lines are coming closer, for lack of a better word, that everyone independent of race is making closer to the same income, I think is a decent thing. I'm not arguing for equality. I'm not arguing for socialism or something like that. But I think it's just an encouraging element to see that we're all doing better in that sense.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, it seems to me that anything, or maybe not anything, but adding to your diversity does end up being a good thing in the long run. Having differing points of view is very important to being able to answer complicated and complex questions.
Right. And bringing this all broadly together, we talked about the race part, we're talking about the part of the growth and the fears that we have in the state, but just bringing that all together under one umbrella, I would say the takeaway from this is that, one, we're doing pretty great in Idaho for growth overall over the last couple of years, but overall that, one, we should be very thankful that we live in the state that we live in, and that we have the blessings the Lord has given us, that we have a thriving economy, that it's good that you can go start a small business, and that not to lose hope, because I think a lot of people right now, a lot of the news nationally, I'm not going to say that everything's sunshines and rainbows, right? But we also do, as human beings, need to actually have a conscious effort to look at the good things in life, because we'll naturally see all the bad things and the worries and concerns. But that for us on the Treasure Valley, that as a state, we're really, really blessed, and we should be really, really thankful for it. And that this is a good sign, and that, there's opportunity. Don't play the victim card. You live in a wonderful, wonderful state that all the numbers that we see currently, they're going up. We're doing better. But thankfully, we're in a little bit of a safer place if things get worse in other areas.